Okay, so this lecture then is about arthropods. Arthropods are animals that have jointed limbs. So arthro from joint, as in arthritis, and pod as in leg. So this includes animals like insects, um, millipedes, centipedes, crustaceans, things like crabs and lobsters, water fleas, also chelicerates, spiders, scorpions, mites, and ticks, and so on. Now, this cartoon shows you, very roughly, animals drawn in proportion to the species richness within the groups that they represent. So there's this enormous beetle hovering over the landscape, and that's because this represents insects. There are more species of insect than any other major animal group. There's also an enormous spider down here. The chelicerates, the group to which the spiders belong, are also hugely diverse. Now, if we were to have split up this life of Earth unit in proportion in time to the species richness of the groups that we were talking about, most of last semester and this semester would have had to have been given over to talking about arthropods. And most of that time would have been given over to talking about insects. And the majority of that time would have been given over to talking about beetles, because there are a vast number of beetles already described, and probably many, many more that we haven't yet described. So arthropods are hugely successful, both in terms of their species richness and in terms of their numbers and their ecological diversity as well. They're hugely important contributors towards ecosystems, both in the sea, freshwater, and on the land. And so they are a fantastically flexible and versatile group. Just to orient ourselves, these are arthropods down here. You can see they're members of the Ecdysozoa. And ecdysozoans are animals that have to shed their cuticle in order to grow. Now, the other group of ecdysozoans that we've looked at are the nematodes. And nematodes, you may remember, are worms, and they have the ability to move their body in a nice sinusoidal way. Their cuticle, therefore, is nice and flexible. They don't, of course, have any limbs, but they retain this flexibility. And although they are ecdysozoa and they grow by molting, they have a flexible cuticle. Arthropods, on the other hand, have by and large a much more rigid cuticle. It maintains some flexibility, but it's built up of plates, cylinders, plates, and so on that articulate, and they have thinner cuticle at those articular joints, and that's like being in a suit of armour almost. So everything moves in a very sort of mechanical, jointed way, hence arthropod. So just to remind you then, we've also covered in previous lectures annelids, so those are Lophotrochozoa, as are the platyhelminths. Last semester we did this part of the tree, and in the upcoming 2 lectures after this, we're going to look at mollusks, so another group of Lophotrochozoa, more closely related to annelids, and we're going to look at the echinoderms, the spiny-skinned animals, things like starfish, sea urchins, and as you'll see, these are the closest relatives, the closest invertebrate relatives of the chordates. And that will lead in nicely to Nick Longrich's lectures on the chordata. So then, just to remind ourselves, arthropods, ecdysozoans, sometimes this is given the status of a superphylum, and it contains, as well as the arthropods, 2 other groups up here, the tardigrades and the onychophorans. And there's general agreement that these things, the water bears, the tardigrades, and the velvet worms, or the onychophorans, belong next door to the arthropods. Now, some people include the arthropods proper and the onychophorans together within a group that they rename the arthropods, and then they call the arthropoda euarthropods or true arthropods. And some people also include the tardigrades in a group that they call panarthropods. So it's just broadening out the catchment slightly to include these other groups. So most people, I think now, consider that the onychophorans belong next door to the euarthropods, with the tardigrades a little bit further out. But I think there are a sizable number of people that would also place the tardigrades next door to the arthropods or the euarthropods, with the onychophorans next out. And the problem is those branches at the base of that part of the tree are very, very small, and it's difficult to know which group comes first. So the other groups then within the Ecdysozoa include the nematodes that we've already seen, close relatives to the nematodes, the horsehead worms or the nematomorph worms, and then two groups which are often put together in the Scalidophora because they have scalids or teeth, spines, various types of hook on an irreversible part of the anterior region of the body called the pharynx, and these are the chinorhynchs and the priarpilids or the penis worms. So it's the arthropods, the euarthropods, that we're going to mostly focus on. But let's just consider the general properties then of Ecdysozoa. They have an exoskeleton. It's a non-living covering. It provides both protection from infection and mechanical protection and support. In order to grow, they have to shed the exoskeleton. They have to make a new cuticle underneath that's often sort of rucked up, and then when they shed the old one, they have to expand quickly and then typically harden the new cuticle. We think, we're fairly sure in fact, that the Ecdysozoa being a clade, a natural group, that the ability to molt the cuticle only evolved once. As we've seen, some ecdysozoans have rather worm-like bodies, others have bodies that are covered in plates of cuticle. If you've got a thin cuticle, that's great. You can exchange gases across it. But if you've got a thicker cuticle, you have to have more specialised structures for gaseous exchange, as we'll see. This is one possible tree of Ecdysozoa. And just to run through those groups that we've seen very briefly, the Scalidophora down at the bottom of this is the node in the tree that shows you the Ecdysozoa. Things outside of here are members of the Lophotrochozoa, but within the Ecdysozoa then the Scalidophora, the chinorhynchs and the penis worms, probably the first group to branch off. Then we have these nematode and nematomorph worms. And then we go up, and as I say, these branches at this lower part of the tree are very small, and it's difficult necessarily to be sure what order things branch off in. Well, this particular tree from a few years ago has the tardigrades coming off first, the water bears, and we'll look at those in a second. Then the onychophorans or the velvet worms. These are like caterpillars, but as adults almost. And then we go up into the euarthropods, and again the phylogeny within here. For many years this was highly contentious, very, very hotly debated, and lots of different ideas about how the different euarthropod groups fitted together. But there's a consensus emerging now, and it's that the chelicerates, the spiders and the scorpions and the mites and ticks, are the first group to branch off. And these are different from most arthropods because they don't have antennae on the front of the head. So if you think about a spider, the one thing it doesn't have is antennae sticking out, and all other arthropods do. The one thing that they do have, however, is these poison fangs on the front called chelicerae, and that's where the where the name chelicerate comes from these first appendages, the chelicerae, on the front of the animal. And then next up are the mandibulate arthropods. These are arthropods that have mandibles, that they are the third appendages in the head. They're enormous crushing structures, crushing or piercing, and with very strong muscles. And all of the mandibulate arthropods, as well as mandibles, have antennae. So the myriapods, that's to say the centipedes and millipedes, with lots and lots of very similar legs, these are the first group of mandibulates to branch off. And the second group in red here are the pancrustaceans. And the pancrustaceans include both the crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, and so on, and the insects. And it turns out that insects are just one very, very specialised group of crustaceans that have made the transition to the land, as have some other groups of crustaceans. But insects, the hexapods, are a group that have 6 legs, famously head, thorax and abdomen. And as we'll see, in different groups of arthropods there are different patterns. So not all arthropods have this division of the body into 3, head, thorax, abdomen. All insects have it, but not all arthropods have it. So let's consider some of these groups down towards the base of the tree then, and let's look first at the onychophora, the velvet worms. And as I say, these look very much like giant caterpillars as adults. The limbs are fleshy, and although they have an external cuticle, they don't have distinct joints, so that the cuticle isn't hardened up into plates that articulate, much softer, more flexible, hence velvet worms. You can see that they have antennae at the front, and what you can't see quite so well is that underneath these rather fleshy lips they have really sharp jaws that work like a pair of scissors. So these are rather impressive carnivores, and they don't immediately suggest that they would be carnivorous and able to pursue prey, but they have a very clever trick up their sleeve. And these 2 things at the side of the head are called slime papillae, and they're able to squirt glue effectively at their prey. So although they can't catch it up by running after it, they can squirt this glue. They're terrible shots, but they produce a lot of this glue. So they've got glands that go all the way down the body and squirt gallons of this stuff out. Well, not literally, but a lot of this stuff. And many of them are rather beautifully coloured. And these are close relatives of marine groups that we find way back in the Cambrian and even in localities like the Burgess Shale. So these were once vastly more numerous in the sea, and we now find them, of course, in relatively moist habitats where they're most at home. And so rather impressive and lovely, living fossils, I guess, in many respects. Their limbs have these lovely hooks, hooked feet on the bottom. But as you can see, although they've got kind of ridges, there are no joints. So they're kind of fleshy, lobopodous limbs. And there's an onychophoran squirting out glue from the slime papillae. So really quite a clever bit of evolution. Now, it used to be thought that the annelid worms, because they are segmented, you can see the segments of an annelid worm very clearly in its body, and they also, of course, the polychaete annelids have these parapodia stuck out the side. So here we have paired appendages in a segmented body in the annelids. It used to be thought that onychophorans may have evolved from something like an annelid, or indeed from within the annelids. So they modified, so the story went, we no longer believe it, they modified the parapodia into these lobopodous limbs, and then later down the line, maybe in something a bit like a myriapod, the exoskeleton went from being flexible to being hardened up into plates. The limbs acquired their podomeres, that's to say the segments of the limb, and the whole thing became what's called sclerotized. So to sclerotize something means to harden it up. And the euarthropods do that by cross-linking proteins within the cuticle and tanning them and hardening them. They often become darker as a result. So it used to be thought then that annelids somehow, or something like annelids, somehow evolved into onychophorans, and from there into something like the euarthropod. And the whole group was linked together within the articulator. So when I did my degree, that was the story that we were told. And in the late 1990s, it became apparent that with the new molecular phylogeny of animal phyla, it became clear that annelid worms were part of the Lophotrochozoa, and arthropods were part of the Ecdysozoa, so a completely different group of major clade of animal evolution. So the segmentation in annelids and the segmentation in onychophorans and arthropods is probably relic of something much, much deeper, and possibly, according to some people, a convergent phenomenon. So onychophorans then have chitinous cuticle, a molting, which is an arthropod-like feature, but in common with annelids, they have these fleshy appendages and also paired nephridia. So remember in annelids they had those nephridia within each segment. Well, onychophorans have got that too, but again, that's probably a much deeper homology within the tree. So this bit of the story is definitely not true now. This bit, however, the fact that onychophorans are closely related to euarthropods is. So there's this other rather fabulous little group, the tardigrades, and again, these are close to the base of euarthropod evolution. Some people put them bang next door with the onychophorans further out. Other people put them round the other way, with the onychophorans closest to the euarthropods and the tardigrades further out still. But in common with the onychophorans, they have these rather hook-like limbs, lobopodous limbs again, so flexible, fleshy sort of limbs rather than jointed limbs. The homology, in fact, of the body of the water bear, when people have looked at the expression of Hox genes, is far more similar to the head of an arthropod. So it's almost like they don't have a body, they're just sort of heads that walk around almost. But in common with the euarthropods, they have, or many of them have, these plates of cuticle on the back that serve for protection, and flexible cuticle covering the rest of the body. So that's why many people put the tardigrades closer to the euarthropods, because they're starting to form these plates of cuticle. However, when we look at the fossil record of other lobopods, things like onychophorans, we find that many fossil onychophorans have those plates too. So this is an SCM of a rather nicely coloured SCM of a tardigrade, and they're sometimes called moss piglets because of this superficial resemblance. And I couldn't help myself. Many people have noted the similarity between the pig flying over Battersea Power Station on Pink Floyd's Animals to a tardigrade, but tardigrades for some reason have a long association with rock music and with they've appeared in a number of cartoons as well as plot lines. Tardigrades, must dig out all the references for you anyway. But the truth about tardigrades is far more interesting than fiction. They are amazingly clever organisms. They have an amazing ability to withstand all sorts of things that would kill most things. So they're tiny, between 0.05 and the very biggest get up to about 1.5 millimeters in size, about 1,000 species. They can go into stasis, they can go into suspended animation. You can dry them or freeze them, and they seem resistant. Most animals that are able to withstand desiccation do that with trehalose, which is basically two glucose molecules joined together, and they use that to join to their cell membranes to stop their cell membranes rupturing, because that's usually the problem when things freeze, is that ice crystals break the cells apart and kill everything off. And most things that are able to withstand freezing coat their cell membranes with trehalose. But and that was assumed that was what was happening in water bears and tardigrades, but it's been found that they use a completely different mechanism using protein molecules, and people are studying this to see how this whole thing works. But so you can heat them up briefly to 150 degrees or down to absolute zero, or as close as you can get to that for a few minutes, and they seem to, once you warm them up again, they seem to be fine, and they can certainly survive at sort of natural temperatures, of cold temperatures for very, very much longer, so weeks or months, at sort of -20 or -40 or thereabouts. So an amazing tolerance. They're also they're amazing. You can get them dried and just add water and they wander off. Radiation, incredible ability to withstand ionizing radiation that would kill kill anything really. So 500 rads is enough to kill you of X-rays. You can give tardigrades 1,000 times that, and they seem reasonably happy. Well, I don't know whether they're happy. I don't know what makes a tardigrade happy, but they at least carry on. You can stick them in a vacuum, evacuate all the air from a cylinder, and with tardigrades in there, and they seem to be happy enough when you let the air back in. Or you can pressurize them. You can expose them to 1,200 atmospheres of pressure, and they just say all right. And they're found pretty well everywhere. So moss piglets or water bears should be much better known than they are, and doyens of popular culture. But they are rather cute, particularly, oh, here we go, particularly that one there. Right, so then, water bears, tardigrades, possibly the sister group to the onychopherans and the euarthropods, or possibly it's the other way round, with onychopherans sister group to water bears plus euarthropods. So we're moving now into the euarthropods, things with jointed limbs and a sclerotized cuticle. So they have this external skeleton they have to molt in order to grow, jointed limbs, and just to bung a couple of things into the mix here, they have a dorsal heart, indeed a ventral nerve cord, and increasing cephalization, so more and more grouping of segments into a head and putting your sense organs, and increasingly sophisticated sense organs, into that head. So here's a sagittal section down through the middle of just a made-up arthropod, just to show some of the features. So antennae, you may remember that not all arthropods have antennae, so those are optional, but those are found within the mandibulate arthropod groups, not found in the chelicerates, so the spiders and the scorpions. They've got eyes, and eyes of a variety of types. So compound eyes, faceted eyes of the sort that we see in insects and crustaceans. Those have lots of lenses and ommatidia that make up a compound picture. But many arthropods also have ocelli, little ocelli on the top of the head. Insects have 3 of these, and these are simple eyes with a lens that may not form such an impressive image, but they are responding to different types of information, motion versus image acuity, or indeed to different wavelengths, as variously specialised in different groups of arthropods. So often not just 2 eyes, but often maybe 5 or maybe 8 in many spiders, for example. There's a labrum, or a top lip, effectively sort of a backwards pointing shovel. And the reason that shovel is pointing backwards is in many arthropods that the food either is processed along a ventral food groove, which lies between chewing surfaces that may, in some arthropods, run all the way down the trunk, and that's the sort of thing we see in the extinct trilobites or in the living horseshoe crabs. These chewing surfaces are called gnathobases, and so the food is passed anteriorly and then scooped up, usually by specialist appendages around the mouth. The gut, of course, is complete. It's often divided into a fore, mid and hind gut. The foregut and the hindgut is lined with ectoderm, so it's lined with cuticle, and that cuticle is molted or ecdiced at ecdysis, so it has just the anterior and posterior linings of the extremities of the gut have to be shed, as well as the external cuticle. The rest of the cuticle usually divided into these plates. Dorsally they're called tergites, ventrally they're called sternites, and there's often flexible cuticle in between, and indeed in the joints between those tergites and sternites that allow for a varying degree of flexibility, allow the animal to flex its body. And in many animals the abdominal flexibility will be much greater. So if you think about a locust, for example, laying its eggs, it's able to extend the abdomen with those flexible regions of the cuticle. The heart then is dorsal, and primitively at least it seems to extend much of the length of the trunk, and it has these little holes along its length within each segment, and these take in blood, and blood is then squirted out the end of this anteriorly into the cephalic region here. And it's not a closed circulatory system as we saw in annelids, it's an open system. And so blood is squirted into the coelom or the hemocoel, and the hemolymph, the blood, sloshes around effectively within this cavity. So the gut, for example, is bathed in hemolymph. And then a brain at the front end, and these connectives that run around the gut down to join the double ventral nerve cord. So you can see the 2 branches of the nerve cord joined by ganglia within each segment. Post-anally, there's often a telson, and anteriorly there may or may not be a cephalic shield or carapace covering the head and often part of the thorax as well. So the limbs are also specialised rather beautifully. Primitively, arthropod appendages are what are called a biramus. There are 2 branches to them. There's an internal, or around that way as you're looking at, and there's an internal walking branch or endopod, the inner ramus, and this is as suggests the walking bit, and there's a more dorsal exopod or outer ramus, and often this is modified as a gill or other flap-like, maybe locomotory appendage in some arthropods. And in many arthropods, these exopods are either hidden, so they're present in a crab, but they're up under the carapace, so you never see them unless you're eating a crab and you pull it to pieces. And in many other groups, for example, the myriapods and the hexapods, so things like millipedes, centipedes, and insects, this outer branch, this outer gill branch, the exopod, has been lost entirely, and it's only the inner branch. Now, there's another branch in some arthropods, in some crustaceans. They also have this thing called the epipodite, and that's often important for respiration. The two basal joints of the limb are called the coxa and the basis. The basis is the bit that the other branches articulate with. The coxa joins the body, and it also on the midventral line has these structures called endites, chewing surfaces, that constitute the gnathobasis. So you have to imagine another limb on the other side here going off and doing the opposite mirror image thing, and then in the middle here is this ventral food groove. So in something like a trilobite, then every pair of limbs has a gnathobase down the centre, and there's this food groove going anteriorly up to the labrum and the mouth.